In the winter of 1907, on the edge of a small Illinois town most maps barely bothered to name, a night watchman stepped into a hallway that should have been empty and heard children singing behind a locked brick wall. Not in a dormitory, not in the chapel, not in the nursery wing where the youngest slept, behind the wall. He stopped with his lamp raised. The hour was just after 2 in the morning. The building was an old orphan house, 3 stories above ground, respectable in the daylight, severe in the cold, with a narrow iron fence and a bell tower that no longer rang. Snow had sealed the yard, the doors were bolted, the children were accounted for, and yet, according to the one statement later copied into a county ledger, the sound came from below the east corridor, where no room officially existed. The watchman did what ordinary men do when reality slips out of place. He told himself it was pipes, wind, memory, a trick of stone. Then he heard a woman say very clearly, "Don't let them take the names." By dawn, he filed no proper report. By noon, the orphan house board called it confusion. And by the end of that week, the night matron, who had served there for nearly 20 years, spoke privately to a local minister, named a hidden record room beneath the lower floor, and said there were admissions written there that did not match the children upstairs. 2 nights later, that room burned. Officially, the fire was small, contained, unremarkable, a storage incident in a sealed basement archive. No fatalities, no major damage. The house remained open. The papers said little. The county said less. But people in town remembered the smell. Not wood, not coal, paper, wet plaster, ink, cloth bindings, a burn that lasted longer for one room and too clean for an accident. That is where this story begins, not with a ghost tale, not with folklore, with a building, a woman, a locked space under the floor, and records that disappeared immediately after she spoke. And once you see the pattern around that night, it becomes harder to believe this was just an orphanage fire. Because the deeper you go into the Illinois Orphan House case, the stranger the timeline becomes. Floor plans that changed between inspections, a sub-basement omitted from later surveys, children listed under one surname in church rolls and another in county aid books, deliveries of coal to a furnace wing larger than the official square footage required, and witness after witness describing a lower level they were later told had never existed. Most people hear a story like that and ask the wrong first question. Did it happen? The better question is this: why do so many hidden history cases begin the same way? A place everyone can point to, a record no one can now produce, a witness who speaks late, and a fire, collapse, flood, demolition, or clerical correction that arrives just in time to erase the one room that might have answered everything. The Illinois Orphan House was not famous. That matters. Famous places attract scrutiny. Quiet places absorb secrets. And if the night matron told the truth, then the burned record room did not just contain names. It contained a second version of the house.
To understand why that matters, you have to picture the building before it became a rumor. The orphan house sat on slightly raised ground outside town, built in stages between the late 1860s and the 1880s. On paper, it was charitable, a refuge for children left by illness, rail accidents, industrial deaths, winter epidemics, and the long aftershocks of a country that was modernizing faster than families could survive it. Its annual reports, where they survive in fragments and references, described order, scripture, discipline, health, and moral instruction. That was the public face. But old institutions often have 2 lives, the life they print and the life they manage. Former workers later remembered the place as colder than it should have been, not emotionally, physically. They said parts of the lower hall stayed chilled in summer and oddly warm in January. They described doors that led nowhere, steps that ended at walls, and a service corridor on the east side where carts could be moved without crossing the main floor. One woman, who had been a kitchen helper as a girl, recalled hearing the phrase "down ledger" from older staff and being slapped for repeating it. Then there was the matron. Her name appears in later retellings as Mrs. Vale, though in some mentions the surname shifts. What remains consistent is her role. She supervised the children at night. She knew who cried in sleep, who feigned illness, who hid bread, who whispered after lights out, who vanished into silence after being told they were being transferred. She was not a trustee or donor. She was the kind of person institutions rely on and then bury in footnotes, which is exactly why her words matter. According to the minister's account, preserved only in a much later family recollection, she came to him pale, trembling, and determined. She did not speak like a woman chasing superstition. She spoke like a woman who had spent years obeying the rules and had suddenly decided she could no longer carry what those rules protected. She said there was a room under the east side of the house, not a furnace room, not a food cellar, a record room, accessed by a service stair hidden behind a linen partition and locked by 2 separate keys kept by different officials. She said some children admitted there were never meant to remain in the visible population of the house. Their files were maintained separately. Their names were entered, crossed, altered, and in certain cases removed. Removed from what? That is the question she reportedly could not finish answering before she broke down. She told the minister the lower room had shelves, trunks, baptism slips, medical notes, transfer pages, and a cabinet containing correspondence marked with county seals. She said one ledger used symbols beside names instead of full remarks. She said some entries referred not to parents or deaths, but to conditions, measurements, and restricted presentation. And she insisted that if anyone ever examined those records against the main dormitory lists, the house would not survive the comparison. Think about that for a second. An orphanage can hide neglect. It can hide disease. It can hide illegal adoptions, labor placements, abuse, and financial fraud. Those are already dark enough. But the language she allegedly described does not sound like normal bookkeeping. It sounds like classification. And then there was the other detail. She said some of the children below were not children at all. Not in the usual sense.
After the matron spoke, the clock started ticking. That is how these cases work. The moment a quiet witness turns verbal, the machinery around them either discredits, isolates, or erases, sometimes all three. Within 48 hours, the east side lower chamber burned. The official explanation called it a basement flare-up from faulty lamp handling by staff storing winter supplies, but later descriptions do not line up cleanly. A storeroom does not usually require restricted keys. A supply closet does not produce wagon loads of ash mixed with metal hinges and binding clasps. And ordinary storage fires do not lead trustees to forbid workers from discussing what room had burned. One stable boy, interviewed years later by a local school teacher collecting town memories, said he delivered water barrels to the site before sunrise and saw men carrying out charred shelving boards and book iron, his phrase for the blackened hardware that once held ledgers shut. He also said the rear cellar door stood open wider than he had ever seen them, and that the air smelled sour like hospitals. Another thread comes from a doctor who visited the house on illness calls. His surviving notes do not mention a secret room directly, but in one margin, beside a winter entry for fever checks, he wrote, "Population count inconsistent with bed count on East inspection." That single line has haunted everyone who has looked into this story. because it suggests the visible numbers inside the house did not match the bodies associated with it. Then there are the children themselves. A woman who claimed to have spent part of her early childhood there, speaking decades later, described hearing older girls warn the younger ones never to follow staff carrying blankets to the understairs. She said every few months there would be whispers about a boy or girl who had been sent away, yet no wagon was seen leaving, no farewell was made, and no priest was called for burial. They were simply no longer spoken of. She remembered one name in particular, Eli, a tall, quiet child who had trouble fitting standard shoes and who ducked under door frames in a way she found funny when she was small. One week he was there, the next week she was told she had imagined him. Imagined him. That word shows up again and again in buried history testimony. The witness remembers. Authority reframes memory as confusion. The person learns that survival depends on doubting what they saw. But the strangest account did not come from a child or servant. It came from a mason hired years later to repair settling on the east foundation. He claimed the lower courses of brick did not match the visible construction dates. In plain language, the underground section seemed older than the orphan house above it. He described blocked arches, filled openings, and a wall line suggesting the structure had been built onto something pre-existing. When he asked why the foundation ran deeper under one wing than the plans indicated, he was told to finish the repair and forget the question. So now the case widens. A secret room is one thing, a burned archive is another, but a charitable institution built over older lower architecture? That turns the story from scandal into pattern. Because once lower spaces start appearing where no official map admits them, you are no longer just dealing with hidden records, you are dealing with hidden layers. And if the house sat on older buried construction, then the room the matron described may not have been created for the orphanage at all. It may have been inherited.
This is where the official story becomes less stable. County histories written later present the orphan house as difficult but ordinary. Tight funds, severe winters, occasional illness, administrative turnover, no sensational claims, no underground wing, no burned records worthy of special note. If you trusted only those summaries, you would never suspect anything more than hardship and faded memory. But buried cases rarely collapse because of one dramatic contradiction. They unravel through clusters of smaller ones. Why do inspection descriptions of the East Side change over time? Why do some renovation references mention lower access reinforcement without clearly defining what was being reinforced? Why do later property surveys flatten the footprint into a cleaner rectangle than earlier descriptions suggest? Why do multiple oral accounts mention the same side of the building, the same sealed area, the same sense that movement happened below the visible floor? And why, after the fire, did the matron disappear from the public trails so completely? No clear death notice, no remarriage record tied confidently to her, no long local defense of her reputation. She enters the story at the exact moment hidden records are mentioned, and then she dissolves into absence. That alone does not prove suppression, but in these histories, absence is often the loudest clue. There is another possibility, too, one darker than bad bookkeeping or criminal neglect. What if the orphan house did not simply conceal vulnerable children? What if it functioned as a receiving place for unusual ones? Across hidden history folklore, newspaper oddities, medical side notes, and family testimonies, the same fringe theme returns.
Children whose size, proportions, growth, or physical traits made them difficult to place inside polite society. Officially, those stories are scattered, exaggerated, or dismissed. Unofficially, they cluster around poorhouses, church homes, sanitariums, mission schools, and orphan institutions where documentation could be controlled. That does not mean every giant bone story is true. It does mean the record-keeping environments around such claims were often the easiest places to alter a life on paper. Imagine the logic from the institution's point of view. A child arrives with no reliable family protection, carrying a condition that would attract rumor, exploitation, fear, or outside inspection. You do not put that child in public view. You classify, you isolate, you rename, you move them through private correspondence instead of open ledgers. And if a trusted insider threatens to reveal the separate system, you destroy the system before anyone can compare columns. Now add the buried city angle. The house appears to have stood over older substructures, possibly from an earlier foundation complex, service level, or even a prior building phase swallowed by later grading. That matters because hidden lower architecture gives institutions something priceless. Spaces no one expects, spaces that can be denied, spaces that can disappear into the phrase "old cellar." Once that possibility enters the frame, the orphan house stops looking like an isolated mystery. It starts looking like a node in a much older habit of burying uncomfortable realities beneath newer narratives. Build over it, rename it, use it, seal it, redraw the plan, burn the papers. Then wait one generation. By then, all you need is an official file and a patient tone, and the people who remember will sound insane.
But if we follow the most troubling implication of the matron's testimony, the story becomes bigger than one Illinois building. Because the phrase that echoes through every version of this case is not fire, it is names. Don't let them take the names. That line matters because names are the bridge between body and history. Burn a room and you destroy paper. Remove a name and you destroy continuity. You sever testimony from census, grave from parish book, admission from transfer, child from bloodline. Once the name goes, the person becomes rumor. That is why so many buried past stories feel impossible to prove. Proof was not merely lost, it was structurally broken. If the lower ledger in the orphan house tracked children who did not fit the visible categories of the institution, then those entries may have represented lives diverted off the normal record path, not just hidden within the building, but hidden within the archive of the nation itself, a parallel line of admissions, a quiet traffic of bodies, conditions, placements, and disappearances routed through the one kind of place least likely to be challenged by the children inside it. An orphan cannot easily contradict the file written over them. And if some of those children were physically unusual, older than they appeared on paper, or connected to wider discoveries people wanted contained, then the orphan house may have served a second purpose no donor brochure would ever confess. Not care, containment. Now think about how often strange discoveries appear near transitions in land use. Old mounds cut for roads, burials exposed by rail work, foundations uncovered under civic buildings, sealed chambers found during plumbing replacements, bones reclassified, photos lost, newspaper items printed once then never followed. The public sees fragments, institutions see patterns, and when the pattern is dangerous enough, records are not debated, they are managed. This is what gives the Illinois case its lasting gravity. The orphan house sits at the intersection of all three of your hidden lines: testimony, buried architecture, and the possibility of classified human anomalies. A night matron speaks, a hidden room burns, a lower structure refuses to fit the surface plan. Witnesses describe vanished children. A doctor marks inconsistent population counts. Later histories smooth the edges. The case becomes local legend, then dust. But legends usually grow from embellishment. This one grows from subtraction. Every important element is not exaggerated into the record, it is reduced out of it. And that should unsettle you. Because when a lie gets repeated, it often becomes louder over time. When a truth gets buried, it becomes thinner, shorter, harder to cite, easier to mock. It survives only in side remarks, family warnings, odd construction notes, overheard phrases, private shame, and one line somebody remembered too late. That is why the matron's decision feels so dangerous even now. She did not claim to solve everything. She did something far more threatening. She pointed to the room. In mysteries like this, the room is everything. Not because it proves the grandest theory, but because it proves somebody knew the official map was false. And once the map is false, every dismissal built on that map starts to crack.
So what really stood under the Illinois Orphan House? A hidden archive for legal transfers? A sealed ward for children kept off the public rolls? An inherited lower chamber from an older buried structure repurposed by the institution above it? A place where the wrong bodies, the wrong measurements, the wrong bloodlines, or the wrong stories were stored until paper could make them disappear? Maybe the cleanest answer is also the most chilling. It was a place where reality was edited before it reached history. That is why the night matters, not because a wall sang, not because one frightened watchman heard a voice in the dark, but because for a brief moment the people inside the machine lost control of the sequence. First came the witness, then came the confession, then came the fire. Usually the fire comes first. And in that reversed order, we catch a glimpse of panic. Somebody believed the room mattered enough to burn immediately. Somebody believed whatever sat on those shelves could not survive daylight, comparison, or memory. Somebody believed names were more dangerous than flames. That should stay with you, because buildings do not always vanish when they are demolished. Sometimes they remain underfoot, flattened into basements, stitched into foundations, sealed behind later walls, waiting for one repair, one flood, one collapse, one bored contractor, one family trunk, one surviving letter to expose the lower world beneath the official one. And the orphan house, if these fragments point anywhere close to the truth, was never just a home for the abandoned. It was a filter. A quiet place at the edge of town where children could enter one version of the record and leave through another, where old underground spaces provided privacy older than the institution itself, where a matron finally saw enough names crossed out to understand that forgetting was not an accident, it was policy. Maybe that is why stories like this keep pulling people back, not because they want fantasy, because somewhere deep down they recognize the shape of organized forgetting. They know that when authorities say a room never existed, the first thing to ask is who had to remember it in silence. So if you listen to hidden history cases, listen for what gets flattened: the sealed basement, the extra stair, the child nobody can place, the witness who speaks once and disappears, the file gap, the burned annex, the official summary that feels a little too smooth. That is where the buried past breathes. And maybe the most disturbing part of the Illinois Orphan House story is this: if the matron had stayed quiet one more week, we might never even know a second set of records had existed. The fire would have been just another maintenance note, the lower room just another rumor, the children just another number rounded into charity. Instead, one frightened woman left a fracture in the story, just enough for us to see through. If you are the kind of person who pays attention when history sounds too polished, then you already know this case isn't really over. because somewhere in courthouse dust, church margin notes, family boxes, land surveys, forgotten repair bills, or misfiled county correspondence, pieces of that lower ledger may still survive in disguise. And if they do, then the orphan house did not keep it secret. It only delayed who would inherit it. So the next time you hear that an old institution's records were lost in an ordinary fire, ask yourself one question before you move on. What had just been said out loud?